with the power of its language is the place to begin. And so I quote, "It was thus the black worker, as founding stone of a new economic system in the 19th century and for the modern world, who brought civil war in America. He was its underlying cause, in spite of every effort to base the strife upon union and national power. That dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in the West Indies and Central America, and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry, shares a common destiny. It is despised and rejected by race and color, paid a wage below the level of decent living, driven, beaten, prisoned, and enslaved in all but name, spawning the world's raw material and luxury, cotton, wool, coffee, tea, cocoa, palm oil, fibers, spices, rubber, silks, lumber, cotton, gold, diamonds, leather. How shall we end the list, and where? All these are gathered up at prices lowest of the low, manufactured, transformed, and transported at fabulous gain. And the resultant wealth is distributed and displayed and made the basis of world power and universal dominion and armed arrogance in London and Paris, Berlin and Rome, New York and Rio de Janeiro. Here is the real modern labor problem. Here is the kernel of the problem of religion and democracy, of humanity. Words and futile gestures avail nothing. Out of the exploitation of the dark proletariat comes the surplus value filched from human beasts which, in cultured lands, the machine and harnessed power veil and conceal. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black." So these words come from W.E.B. Du Bois's masterpiece, written in 1930, published in 1935, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880. Now, when I was asked to speak to you in this historical methods class about history from below, and to speak about a book that I thought was a good representation of history from below, I not only thought of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction immediately, I also decided immediately that would be the book that I would talk about. It's had a big influence on me. You all are MA students, and when I was an MA student in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University, they had a really nice tradition in the faculty seminar. When someone would give a presentation, they would always bring a physical book with them, kind of put it on the table, just as a kind of reference point, as a work that had influenced the presentation that we were listening to. And I had the opportunity, I was really lucky, I had the opportunity to present in that seminar. And this orange copy of Black Reconstruction, this is the very book that I brought then as well, and placed on the table, which our relationship with physical books can be important as well. I purchased this for $14. Some of the best $14 I ever spent in McLeod's Books, a used bookstore in Vancouver. So this copy is important to me, and this book is really important to me, and it has been for a long time. So it was clear that this was the book that I wanted to talk about, clear to me right away. But what I wanted to do here was maybe, as I was thinking a little bit today about how I might gather some remarks about the book, I thought maybe I would say a bit before getting into a bit more about Black Reconstruction, is maybe saying a bit more about some other books that I also think are really great examples, and so that can kind of history from below, and then maybe that can give us a kind of a context, a kind of a place within which a larger kind of intellectual landscape in which to situate Du Bois's book. Though I think of all the books I'm about to mention, Du Bois's has got to be the oldest. So actually, it's more all of these books follow consciously or unconsciously in the wake of this really, really important study. So for many people, for many historians, E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class is often another starting point. This 1963 also tremendously important classic study, a brilliant study. And a couple of things about that make this book so important are the kind of well, first of all, the kind of theorizing of class dynamics, which takes place, looking at class as kind of a process as much as a sort of structural location, but also the way in which this book is at once a kind of labor history and a community history. And so there's ways of thinking about class and class formation as what happens in the workplace for working class people, but obviously what happens well beyond that as well. So labor history, and I'm starting there, is a key kind of site from which many important histories from below have been produced. More recently, Julie Green's The Canal Builders. To my mind, this is a book that really builds on that kind of central insight from Thompson, that looking at the workers who built the Panama Canal in its epic sort of scope, dangerous, sometimes deadly work. That these workers were also sort of part of a community. They were forming community as they were arriving in the canal zone and doing this work. So this, if you may already be quite familiar with Thompson's book, Green's is quite a nice kind of study to maybe follow that up with if you want to think about labor history and community history as history from below. Any discussion of labor history has to make reference to Nelson Lichtenstein. He's one of the most influential figures in the field. And I was thinking about which of his books to kind of mention here, and I kind of landed on State of the Union, which is a kind of overview labor history in the United States across the 20th century. And a couple of things that make this book notable, and again, for ways of thinking about history from below and the way that it connects to other kinds of fields and traditions. This is a history from below. It's a history of working people, but it's also really an intellectual history. It's a history that thinks about ways that labor has been kind of thought about and theorized. It also does something really important in showing how and in arguing that in order to think about history from below, you need to think about these subaltern groups or individuals that are being written about in the context of the larger kind of society in which they live. So in other words, this is a history of workers. This is a history of ideas about workers, but it's also really a history of capitalism as well. And so this book is kind of quite significant in terms of that shift of thinking about labor history and thinking about it as also history of capitalism, kind of at the broadest level. Sort of borrowing from the theme here that this is a history from below, which is also an intellectual history. I was thinking of other kind of histories that did this, because we sometimes think of intellectual history as very much history from above, very well placed theorists and writers in universities, in government, and so on. But there's some great examples. Here's a couple that came to mind. Priya Lal's African Socialism in Post-Colonial Tanzania and Emma Hunter's Political Thought and the Public Sphere in Tanzania. So these two books are both about Tanzania, less the decolonization struggle and more kind of post-colonial Tanzania. But they look at, the significance of regional difference and of local actors. You really get a good sense of this in Priya Lal's book, looking at the way that local actors and subaltern groups really helped inform and shape socialism in Julius Nyerere's Tanzania. Similarly, with Emma Hunter, you get a sense of kind of, what you might call everyday people as intellectuals, and here, with some really great use of newspapers as well, because obviously all of, like other kinds of history from below really raises the issue of sources in important ways, and Emma Hunter's study is a good one for thinking about history from below as intellectual history with innovative use of sources. Another great history from below, which is also intellectual history, is Annette Joseph Gabriel's Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire. And this book, again, it looks at several different individuals. It's got a biographical kind of emphasis to it as she works from different individuals across the French Empire and also the United States, looking at how Black women were agents, but more than that, looking at how they were theorists, how they were conceptualizing the systems of power that they were within, and the kinds of contestations that they were engaged in, and the kind of societies that they wanted to see. So it's interesting to think about history from below as biography, which we get a bit of a sense in Annette Joseph Gabriel's book. But of course, biography is often the study of one individual, and there are several examples, but a great example of a biographical history from below is George Lipsitz's biography of Ivory Perry, A Life in the Struggle, Ivory Perry and the Culture of Opposition. And Perry was a local community organizer and activist in St. Louis. And Lipsitz is really great at showing how, using the Gramscian terminology, that Perry was an activist and also very much an organic intellectual. Another organic intellectual of note, to my mind, of not enough note, and I feel like more and more people are learning who this person is, Jack Odell, perhaps most famous as one of Martin Luther King's advisors. This is not a biography. It has a fantastic biographical introduction by Nikhil Pal Singh, but this is a collection of Odell's writings. And this is another way that we can think about biography and intellectual history and history from below as kind of coming together here in these brilliant set of essays theorizing racial capitalism in the United States. And so again, the question of sources is an important one, and Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments really does tremendous work with sources, because when writing history from below, of course, there's the sense of the archival trace or lack of the archival presence, silences in the archive, and how to get at these lives that have been marginalized, both by systems of power and also by the kinds of archival what's held by archives or what's deemed important enough to hold in archives and so on. And so Hartman's study of Black women in the United States in the first decades of the 20th century and the late 19th century, it's a tremendous kind of set of community studies. This is a hard book to describe because it's so innovative and it's kind of unique in many ways. But one of the things and it's very much a history from below. And it shows, you get fleeting glimpses, you get senses of community of Black women in different spaces, especially New York. You get a bit more of a focus on particular individuals. But again, the imaginative way, you also get a real sense of Hartman's own very capacious imagination as she weaves together these different stories, and probably often with which wasn't the greatest, the most extensive set of archival materials to begin with. Turning in quite a different direction, I was also thinking about how history from below can be military history. And this is a fascinating book. I'm not a military historian, but I was really gripped by this book by Joshin Helbeck on the Battle of Stalingrad. It's actually it's got a fantastic long introduction by Helbeck. It's actually mostly primary documents recovering the voices from the Soviet side. The German side's been more documented and more studied, and looking at the Soviet side, certainly in terms of the Red Army and those soldiers that were involved, but also some of the individuals and even civilians. It's when I think of the Battle of Stalingrad, I never think of civilians. I almost picture a kind of empty city with just, soldiers battling in it. But there were civilians there, and you get a sense of some of their perspectives on the conflict as well. Of course, history from below and activist history really come together. I mean, that can be also the sense of kind of the people who are drawn to studying history from below, but also the fact that very much activists are exemplars of history, of actors from below. And, one of the most influential studies to my mind of this, at least from my field of U.S. history, is Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe. You might think at first, if you've never heard of this book, the subtitle, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, you might think it's a bit narrow of a topic potentially, but actually it's a hugely important topic, and you get a real sense of the ways that these subaltern actors in the Jim Crow South and the Depression, made use of the Communist Party of the United States to fight against the horrendous system in which they found themselves. You get a sense of the kind of intellectual production of these groups. You get a sense of the ways that African Americans and some of their white allies were located in Alabama, certainly, but also very connected to a much broader set of kind of international and internationalist inclinations. So this is a very important and very influential activist history. Another great activist history from below is Minka Makalani's In the Cause of Freedom. And I call this to your attention partly because, like Robin Kelly's book, it's a great example of activist history and history from below coming together. But it also really reminds us that histories from below can be transnational histories as well. You might get a sense that, in order to get at the subaltern voices that histories from below want to engage in, the geographic scope needs to be narrow. That's not at all the case. And here you see radical Black internationalism from Harlem to London gives us a sense of the kind of Atlantic world scope in the 1920s and 1930s in which this book is looking at. One of the, this one goes, this book, Black Jacobins, goes on the same shelf as Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. C.L.R. James's 1938 study of the Haitian Revolution is a history from below and a brilliant one. It's very influential for many reasons. You've, I'm sure, heard of it. But one of the reasons why I want to bring it up here is because, following from Makalani's book, this is also really a transnational history from below. You get a real sense here that as the enslaved revolted against slavery and brought into existence, of course, the second independent republic in the Americas, that in order to understand that, we need to understand something about the French Revolution. But also really key in James's book, you get a sense that you also need to understand Haiti in order to understand the French Revolution and French society after the Revolution, Napoleonic France as well. So in this sense, the transnational aspect is not some kind of added feature, but really central to the argument as well. This book, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, you might think, well, this is clearly a national history because it says the United States. But when you think with indigeneity and through the lens of settler colonialism, of course, we're reminded that the United States is itself a colonial national entity built upon, innumerable indigenous societies, we might say nations. And so you can think of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, which of course its title echoes the famous People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, as itself also a kind of transnational history, but within the territory of the United States. Another great transnational history from below, one of my favorites, is Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker's The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. So this book is quite far from my own field of 20th century history, but it's just such a brilliant study of the ways that rebellion, the ways that, again, subaltern historical actors in various places acted together and acted in a kind of ongoing way against the consolidation of the kind of sets of power around colonialism and slavery in the Atlantic world. This is a fully global study, Michael Denning's Noise Uprising, the Audio Politics of a World Musical Revolution. This at once tells us that history from below is intellectual history. It's also cultural history, it's music history, and it's global history. This is a great study of I'm not a musicologist or even a music historian, so most of the people written about in this book I'd never heard of before. But I was absolutely fascinated at the ways that in the very late 1920s and very early 1930s, an incredible array of performers recorded music on records in this specific window of time. These records traveled the world on ships. They were listened to in ports around the world, and in many ways provided what became kind of the soundtrack for decolonization later in the century. Another local but also transnational history, and we can think of this as a history from below as well. I'm not sure it's normally thought of in this category, but Yulia Komska's The Icon Curtain, The Cold War's Quiet Border, looks at the West German Czech border during the years of the Cold War, as you can see. But it also really looks at how everyday people made sense of that division. It calls into question, it's kind of ideas about the Cold War within Cold War historiography, but it really is a kind of history from below. And in fact, actually, it's those everyday people's kind of sense making and remaking of the meanings of the Cold War divide that are quite essential to the way that the Cold War is kind of unpacked as a definitive and sort of rigid idea. Also very much a cultural study. Which brings me finally to Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus, Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States. And this looks at the Mohawk community at Kahnawake. And Simpson I wanted to finish with as sort of following from Komska, very much someone who's working with culture, but Simpson is also an anthropologist. This isn't technically a history from below. It's an ethnography by an anthropologist. But this also reminds us that history from below kind of exceeds the discipline of history as well, influencing, but also very much influenced by brilliant kind of scholars of subaltern groups who work in disciplines other than history. Okay, so there's just a few books. I mean, there's so many more kinds of histories from below that we could reference here. But I really want to talk about Du Bois. And to do that, let me get out of this office, move around a bit. I like to get outside when I'm lecturing video content. It'll be maybe more interesting for you to look at than me sitting here in my office. So let me get outside as I make my way home on my bicycle, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I picked Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and why it's a book that you need. It's long too. How many pages? 729 pages. 700 and, well, with the index, 746 pages. This is a long book, but it's a book that you, well, as you can guess, I think that you probably ought to read. But more about that when I get outside in a minute. Okay, well, hi everybody. Me again. Here to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction. I'm going to ride my bike home. Well, actually, I'm at school where I have to pick up my kids. I have this camera on a head strap. I'm just going to turn this around. Because as I said at the end of the first part of the video, it'd be more interesting to have a look at what's going on outside, especially for those students who are distance education students and haven't been to campus, or maybe haven't been to campus recently. As you can see, there's the clock tower, heading out. So this bike ride, the first part I'll be going on the roads, so we'll see how that goes. Hopefully not too noisy. It's a little windy as well. The second part will be through a nice path, so that'll be quieter and more pleasant. So if I'm still rambling by the time I get there, we can check that out too. Okay, so W.E.B. Du Bois then, Black Reconstruction and History from Below. So the first thing to say is something about W.E.B. Du Bois himself. There's so much to say. Maybe one way into it, if you don't know too much about him, I'll tell you that the biography, David Levering Lewis, the historian who wrote Du Bois's biography, wrote it in 2 huge volumes, and each of the volumes won the Pulitzer Prize. So just to give you a sense of just how much content we're talking about here. Another important thing to note right away in terms of Du Bois's biography is simply its duration. Thank you. He's born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Thanks. And he dies in Accra, Ghana on he's born on 23rd of February 1868, and he dies in Accra on, I think it's the 27th of August 1963. Just looking at the traffic here, see if I can get past these cars. So he lives for a really long time. He also lives through quite a range of eras. Born during Reconstruction, he dies quite symbolically. The place and the date of his passing are symbolic because he dies on the eve of the March on Washington, in which Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So there's a way in which you could see that as a kind of passing of the baton of leadership in terms of the long Black freedom struggle in the United States. So his span is key. His accomplishments are many. First African American to get a PhD from Harvard, an important scholar, a founder of the NAACP,
and activist, quintessential scholar activist, I'd say. So let me just make sure I make this left turn safely. Okay, great. So part of why he's significant is exactly that, is the span of his life, the variety of eras that he is prominent during is really important. And he kind of, his own political evolution. I'll say a couple of things. It's hard to pick out just a few details, but I'll say a few things. One of his sort of main kind of tendencies in terms of thinking about black liberation is, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, is known as the idea of the talented 10th. That an elite, an African-American kind of elite would raise up the rest of the community. It was something of an elitist view, but also really needs to be seen in the context of debates he was having with people like Booker T. Washington, who had different kinds of ideas about this idea of uplift. So we might think of that as, in some ways, a bit more conservative, and that Du Bois's trajectory is one that moves more to the left as he progresses. So in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, he's very interested, of course, as were many people around the world for all kinds of reasons, in what was happening in the Soviet Union. And he undertakes in the 1920s a serious study of Marxism. And this really influences, this is what he's thinking through. He's reading Marx's work, he's teaching Marx in the 1920s and early 1930s. And this is a really significant part of the context for Black Reconstruction. So, as is true of many of the practitioners of what we call history from below, have usually had some kind of engagement with Marxism as well, Du Bois being no exception. So he undertakes this monumental task of kind of reading through all of Marx's work, studying, and this is influencing his thinking on Reconstruction, an era that he had already studied for decades. Then to say a little bit more about the rest of his life afterwards, again, there's so much to say, but he, after World War II and the era of McCarthyism, he's really persecuted. He is sort of increasingly a proponent of the Soviet model for human liberation, and particularly for a model of kind of anti-racist liberation. Obviously, in the 1950s, those are difficult politics to hold, and he's persecuted. He's arrested in 1951, I think it is, for being involved in something called the Peace Information Center. Ultimately, in 1960, he leaves the United States permanently. He joins the Communist Party, he leaves the United States, he moves to Ghana, which had become independent under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah in 1957, and he lives the remainder of his days there, and that's where he dies in 1963. Okay, so that's his biography. So in terms of the reasons why Black Reconstruction matters so much, first of all, this would be a huge accomplishment in and of itself. It really reorients scholarly understandings of the Reconstruction era. And we have to remember that Reconstruction, the period after the US Civil War, in which the defeated Confederacy is kind of brought back into the Union, the question is one of how is that going to look? How is the United States going to sort of function without the foundational aspect of racial slavery? And so Reconstruction is a kind of an answer to that question. Now, the appropriateness of Reconstruction as an answer to that question is something that historians, politicians, and sort of creators of popular culture had a great interest in and had much to say about. And the dominant narrative was one of Reconstruction being a kind of inappropriate era of misrule. This is a white supremacist sort of vision, and it's really pervasive. Everybody from filmmakers to presidents to historians. So you've got Dunning in the historical profession. You've got people like D.W. Griffith, the filmmaker. You've got people like historian and later U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. They all had a lot to say about Reconstruction, and they all had a racist kind of interpretation of it. So Du Bois is overturning all of that. It's really pervasive in popular culture through films like Birth of a Nation in 1915, which is a kind of just viciously racist portrayal of Reconstruction, to the, I guess, somewhat more gentler racism of the era depicted in films like Gone with the Wind. So Du Bois is overturning all of that. And History from Below is crucial to how this happens. So Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is anti-racist, and it argues, as in the passage that I read to you earlier, it argues that African Americans themselves, the enslaved, and then the then formerly enslaved, the freedmen as they were called, they're the ones who are the central agents, the actors, the ones who make this all happen. And so they do this by withdrawing their labor, essentially, during the war, and by engaging what he calls the general strike. So again, using a kind of labor history term, again, very influenced by Marxism. He calls Reconstruction the dictatorship of the proletariat at points in Black Reconstruction. So he's thinking about this, thinking about how History from Below, really is essential to understanding what Reconstruction is. And his view of Reconstruction was a minority one in 1935. It's now far and away the dominant one. I mean, people are still arguing about Reconstruction, and you see conservative pieces that harken all the way back to those old white supremacist interpretations. But generally speaking, in the historical field, Du Bois's view of it is definitely the one that most scholars would kind of adhere to. I mean, the most well-known, prize-winning book on the Reconstruction era is that by Eric Foner, his book Reconstruction, which came out in 1988, I think. And it really, sort of holds the Du Boisian view of the era. So we see here History from Below kind of overturning the understanding, and the rest of the profession and the rest of society kind of catches up. Du Bois isn't alone, that's important to note. He's not a sole, solitary genius. Part of his insights, of course, are derived from his activism and the kind of social movement knowledge that informs his scholarship as well. But largely speaking, it's also true that many, kind of later catch up to this being a key kind of insight. And so we can say that Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is part of the Black radical tradition, as Cedric Robinson called it in his book Black Marxism, which is also a great example of kind of a history from below and an intellectual history. So we could think of other examples of kind of representatives of the Black radical tradition who engage in Du Bois's book as well, kind of carrying this forward. Thank you. Jack Odell, who I mentioned before, in the 1960s, during the kind of high point of the civil rights movement, Jack Odell was teaching Black Reconstruction in his voter registration efforts, and really calling attention to this radical era of abolition democracy, which had preceded, the first Reconstruction, which preceded the civil rights movement, which is also sometimes referred to as the second Reconstruction. Martin Luther King is another very good example. Dr. King gives, on Du Bois's 100th birthday, so Du Bois, as I said, passes away in 1963, but on the 23rd of February 1968, after Du Bois had been dead just a few years, Martin Luther King, kind of tragically, very close to the end of his life, which would end just a couple months later when he was assassinated, but Martin Luther King gives this speech honoring Dr. Du Bois in New York. And the speech is largely about Black Reconstruction and its insights and its applicability. So King really directly engages with Du Boisian ideas, and particularly with this book. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is probably a good example of a more contemporary scholar in the Black radical tradition, an activist, and she also, on numerous occasions has drawn on the insights of Du Bois as well. So we can situate that book then and its legacy in terms of this kind of activist tradition, and that's an important way of seeing history from below as informed by activism as well as scholarship. And Du Bois, again, such a kind of important example of both. Okay, another thing that's crucial about Black Reconstruction is its generative theorizing. So, and I'll say this in two ways. One is the relationship between race and class. So yes, Du Bois is using the Marxist class categories to think through what Reconstruction is all about and the kind of revolution that it represents. But he does this obviously with great attention to the racial dynamics at play. And so in this way, we could think of Du Bois perhaps as an intersectional thinker. That term, of course, doesn't get coined until much later by Kimberly Crenshaw. But nonetheless, Du Bois is thinking about race and class together and keeping the two dynamics in play at all time, and not, sort of positing that one is derived from the other, is a really generative intervention that sort of presages, I guess we could say, what an intersectional analysis could look like. Even if Du Bois is not thinking, kind of fundamentally about gender, there's still a kind of generative mode here in which one can think about, it sort of opens the door to thinking about other categories as well through Du Bois's theorization of race and class. Again, coming entirely from a history from below kind of perspective. Secondly, there's Du Bois's, let me just say one other thing. I mean, the contributions are so many, but one of the places this goes, this theorization of race and class, is essentially, you could draw a very direct line from Black Reconstruction back forward to whiteness studies as an entire field, particularly with David Roediger's book, The Wages of Whiteness, which comes out in 1991. And Roediger here draws, of course, the wages of whiteness idea comes directly from Black Reconstruction, some of those late pages where Du Bois is talking about the public and psychological wage that poor whites get through their class loyalty and through not pursuing their kind of that whites get a wages of whiteness from pursuing race loyalty, I should say, and they rather than their shared class interests with African Americans. And so this public and psychological wage sort of deference to white people gives a kind of privilege to whites, which is not material but more psychological, but nonetheless very effective. David Roediger, really takes this up in his book Wages of Whiteness, and this is a kind of foundational book in the entire field of whiteness studies. So that's one of the ways in which the race class theorization is generative. But the other, and maybe last thing I wanted to say, also because I'm almost at the school to pick up my kids, the last thing I wanted to say was that Du Bois's transnational perspective is just really essential to the book, and really also just important as well in two ways. One, this puts U.S. history in a transnational frame, which doesn't really come into vogue until, the 1990s in larger sense, even though there are other examples. So Du Bois is thinking transnationally about US history, but it's also, again, really key to his argument, and it does something really important, this insight. It's not just simply to say, look, US history is also transnational history, but rather to make an important point, which is the democratic experiment of abolition democracy is one that raises a question of what racial justice might have looked like. And if the United States, after racial slavery, after that horrific system, had replaced that with a system of racial justice, and also one based on kind of shared class interests between working class and poor whites and African Americans as well, what would this have done? This would have made for, obviously, more kind of permanently democratic United States, But secondly, it would have had a massive influence internationally because it would have undermined not only the dominant white supremacist ideology in the US, but also the dominant white supremacist ideology that held together imperialism, which obviously in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s was consolidating itself through conquest, through events like the Berlin Congress in the mid-1880s. All of this stuff is premised on ideas of race and white civilization and so on. So what a permanently successful Reconstruction order might have done would have been to undermine that. And so there's a way that, again, the African Americans who were subjugated and who are the central actors in Du Bois's story, they may have changed world history. In fact, they did, of course, but Reconstruction was also overthrown, and the story of white supremacy and the resistance against it from there continued. Okay, so those are some remarks. If anybody wants to talk to me about Black Reconstruction, you can probably guess I'm up for having a conversation about it. It's such an important book. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming on this bike ride, and have a nice day. Bye.